How are you guys? Don't forget to leave a review and enjoy the story. Enjoy watching. The story begins. The sky is covered with clouds. The forest gradually sinks into darkness. Here, on the wasteland, surrounded by monsters, MC fell to the ground. He is not lying down yet, just sitting a slight angle with his eyes closed. And he still has enough strength left to sink into his thoughts about how he simply wanted to become someone who helps people, to become like his great father who fought for this world. But that doesn't mean he wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to be able to protect someone. A few hours ago, in an old house in the city, Julia woke up in his room, where the walls were covered with many small cracks from the weight of the years. The sun was shining brightly through the window, directly onto his bed. MC lay on his back under a warm blanket and, putting his hand to his forehead, stared blankly at the ceiling. After a while, he finally sat up in bed. His face was sad. He really wanted to sleep, but he had to get up, so he overcame his sleepiness and put his feet on the floor. The third barrier city is where Julia Curtis, a 13-year-old second-year student at the Magic Academy, lives. 150 years ago, humanity was defeated by demons and expelled. In their new territories, people built barrier cities. Dark forces reign outside their borders. Due to the huge number of demons, it is very dangerous to be outside the barriers. But even living in cities, people resist them. They have created an academy where they train exorcists who must bring light back to this world. Therefore, MC, as a student of the Magic Academy, also wants to contribute to this cause. Julia changed into his uniform. A cloak hung over his shoulders, and a sword was at his left hip. Heading for the exit, he stopped near a dresser with a photo frame on it, which showed his mom and dad. After saying goodbye to them, MC opened the door and stepped outside. Julia spent the journey reminiscing about his parents. His father was an exorcist, but he died fighting demons when Julia was just a child. Julia remembers that around the same time, his mother died in an epidemic. But MC doesn't feel completely alone because he has a dream. He wants to become as great an exorcist as his father. Julia's classmates were already waiting for her at the academy gates. There were 3 of them. The guy named Dan, standing between 2 girls, had an interesting appearance. The hair on the top of his head stuck up, and the sides and back were shaved. He had several piercings in his left ear, and his smile was more like a smirk. Dan greeted MC first and said that their group was counting on him today. Combat training classes began at the Magic Academy. This meant hunting demons outside the city. It was dangerous, but there was no other way to become a real exorcist. Julia turned to his friends with doubt, unsure whether it was right to send them there to fight alone. After all, they had never done this before. But Dan decided to convince his friend that there was nothing to worry about. He reminded him of the tactic they had used before. He and Leona would go on the offensive, while Nola would remain on defense. Julia could support them with healing and illusion magic. And if they hunted demons in the danger zone, their academy rankings would skyrocket. That way, they would quickly become S-rank exorcists. Usually, the ranking system is divided into A to E, but S-rank exorcists are above everyone else. All students at the Magic Academy want to become one because they are humanity's hope in the fight against darkness. But the MC believes that this is definitely not for him, as he has been only E-rank for an eternity. Dan spoke up, which brought Julia out of his stupor, and he turned his gaze to his friend, listening intently. Dan said that upon their return, they would report everything to the academy themselves, and Julia would just be there. MC replied somewhat uncertainly that he wanted to go with them too. Dan turned his head sharply toward him and said that he was no match for them, as their powers were on a completely different level and the boy should think before he spoke. MC was disheartened by this response. A shadow fell over his face, and his head dropped slightly. But he immediately raised it back up, his eyebrows slightly furrowed, and he quietly agreed with them, trying to hide his slight resentment. The group was already walking through the forest. They stayed close to each other, looking around for demons. Leona called out to Dan to find out if they were already in the danger zone. Dan was walking slightly ahead of her, trying not to show his nervousness, but he couldn't give a clear answer. He was interrupted by Julia, who was walking behind everyone. She saw something to their right and called out to her classmates to look in that direction too. All 4 watched as the creatures sat there behind the bushes. They looked very ugly, more like large, scary birds without feathers. Their bodies were covered with a large amount of muscle. Their eyes were bulging like those of a snake or lizard, and their pupils looked in different directions. Their jaws were like those of crocodiles, and their front limbs were like crescent-shaped blades growing out of bones, which they used to support themselves when moving. But most of the time, they stood on their large bird-like feet, spread wide apart. Exorcists in their circles nicknamed these creatures crow lizards. Dan was the first to react, drawing his sword. A wave of triumph rose in his chest, bursting out in a loud, confident cry of imminent success. There was not as much determination in the MC's eyes, but a short, confident phrase about the upcoming hunt escaped his lips. Sticking to their tried-and-true tactic, Dan and Leona lunged forward in a single bound, attacking. The crow lizard's body was cut in half, spurting a fountain of dark liquid that looked like blood. Nora thrust her sword forward. She whispered a spell, and then a glowing energy shot out of her sword, knocking the demon down with a shock wave. Dan was very pleased with the result, and his excitement and thirst for battle grew. He called on everyone to get to work, to destroy this whole crowd of monsters who wanted the same thing in return. Julia stopped Dan from rushing into battle, as there were too many demons. They surrounded them in a circle while the hunters stood back to back, actively thinking about what to do in this situation. Dan instructed Julia to distract them, wait for the right moment, and strike. MC wanted to object, but they interrupted him, shouting that he should act, otherwise they would all die. A drop of sweat appeared on MC's face from the excitement, but he accepted the instruction. He didn't want to let the guys down. Pulling himself together, he used his magic skill to strengthen his body to the limit, then moved like a bullet. MC rushed forward, his eyes wide open, shouting a battle cry to himself, waving his sword and cutting down everything in his path. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a demon flying towards him, intent on killing him with its sharp limb. MC used illusion magic, and an axe appeared in his hands. He strikes the crow lizard right at the base of its neck. But it was unharmed. There was no blood or anything like that. The monster turned its head from side to side, not understanding what had happened. The other 3 hunters stood aside and watched the MC's actions. Julia was swinging his sword with all his might at that moment, so he couldn't hear what they were saying. Now he stands alone, holding a broken weapon in his hand, his cloak torn in many places. The bloody corpses of the crow lizards were scattered around him. MC examines one of them, a truly disgusting sight. All of its entrails, turned into a bloody mess, are spilling out of its shattered body. He now looks ahead, making a great effort to keep his eyelids from drooping on their own. He continues to breathe heavily, his body trembling with fatigue, sweat streaming down his face. As it turns out, Dan and the others did nothing. They simply ran away and never returned. MC tries to recall what they said then, but he didn't hear them clearly. At that time, they were talking about leaving Julia and going away. MC walked, dragging his feet, and continued to think about what had happened. He had been betrayed, used as bait, even though he knew that this would happen someday. But when it did happen, he couldn't stop shaking from the shock. He was practically torn apart by emptiness and sadness. He threw his useless sword on the ground and decided that no matter what, he had to go back. Suddenly, Julia stops abruptly and looks around. In front of him is a large lattice screen of magical barrier. MC reached out his hand and felt Leona's magic. It turns out he was locked in with a crowd of crow eaters, which made him feel a little funny. Julia turns around and heads in the opposite direction, assuming that he will not be able to return now. MC doesn't know how many days have passed since then, but he is still sure that he will not be able to return to the barrier city. He doesn't want to die, so he has no choice but to move on. The outside world is full of darkness and deadly for humans. Julia wonders what will happen to him if he stays here. An unexpected push forward pulls him out of his thoughts. He didn't notice that he had come to some kind of cliff, just as he didn't notice the rock he tripped over. His frantic arm movements didn't save him, and he tumbled headlong down the cliff. MC landed on his stomach, raising clouds of dust around him. He didn't move, just lay there and stared into empty space. There was not a soul around. His eyebrows were broken, his lips twisted as if in bitterness, and it seemed as if he was about to cry, but he only asked the void why all this had happened to him. He remembered Dan's face and the others again. Rage boiled up inside him, but now everything was as if in a fog. He wanted to live. He didn't want to die. Suddenly, MC felt something inside himself. He struggled to his feet and lifted the right sleeve of his jacket above his elbow. His eyes widened in surprise. Dark patterns suddenly appeared along the entire length of his arm. Julia panicked, thinking that darkness was eating away at his limb, something he had never seen before. But it was destructive to humans, so the question of what was really happening remained open. MC sat back down on the ground, crossed his legs in front of him, and smiled, deciding that it was better not to know. No high-ranking mage had ever been behind the barrier for so long. He thought he was the only person who had stayed in the darkness for so long. But it didn't matter what happened next. Nothing surprised him anymore. MC looked around at the dark forest. He didn't want to die here. Unfortunately for him, he heard a sound very close by and looked in that direction. There stood a huge leader of the raven lizards, opening its large mouth. MC is not surprised. He just wonders if they will eat him now. He looks at the creature's bulging eyes and sharp teeth and remembers that he is actually hungry too. He even wonders how long it has been since he last ate. Then his thoughts turn to death. Julia clenches his teeth. It's too early for him. He hasn't achieved anything yet. He hasn't done anything. His hands clench tightly in a fist from internal tension. He wrinkles his eyebrows and nose, his teeth bare in anger, and sweat beads appear on his face due to feeling unwell. MC slowly rose, overcome with rage. He wanted to help people, but that didn't mean he wanted them to be sacrificed. Julia is already standing firmly on her feet in a fighting stance, thus declaring that she is not going to die here. But opposite her stands a huge monster with its mouth open, ready to devour her. MC needs to defeat it, and he needs a weapon, which he does not have now. At first, he had the idea of creating an illusion, but remembering his past experience, he decided it was stupid and discarded it. He slowly crouched down and fell for a stick on the ground next to him. Picking it up, he clenched it tightly in his hand. Last time, his body moved on its own. He didn't even have time to think. Now, Julia could only distract the demon with her illusion magic, but for some reason, he felt that she had a better use for it. In his hand, clutching a simple branch, an inner light seemed to flare up. From it, a glow began to flow, like smoke, enveloping the blade. A weapon created with magic is useless on its own. After all, the illusion will simply dissipate. Thus, MC decided that it would be better to connect such an illusion with the outside world. He raised his clenched hand. Thin, ghostly threads of energy entwined the tree, turning it into a semblance of a blade, like a materialized dream of a real sword. With a furious cry, Julia rushed forward, directing her ghostly blade straight into the demon's gaping mouth. A moment later, the enemy was left behind, the illusory sword cutting its flesh into many pieces, leaving no chance of survival. Intertwining with the mage's body, intricate dark patterns seemed to give him new strength, flowing into his hand like snakes, wrapping around it. The MC made the final move of his lunge, cutting through the air one last time with his new weapon. He was as if possessed by contempt for danger and determination to survive. The enemy was defeated, but he knew that this was only the beginning of a new life for his new version of himself. Suddenly, Julia put his hand on his stomach, feeling a rumbling. Standing next to the bloody remains, he remembered that he was very hungry and needed to eat. A year has passed since that day. Amidst the Rocky Mountains, MC sits by the fire and roasts meat strung on a branch for himself. He is dressed in old, worn-out clothes, his hair has grown longer, but his dark hand remains unchanged. He tears off the meat with his teeth and chews it carefully and meditatively. The fire is warm, and its tongues of flame are mesmerizing, allowing him to immerse himself in his thoughts. Julia is still wandering in the darkness, and he is moving further and further away from the city. If he found demons, he killed them, ate them, and continued living. During this time, he began to understand how darkness works. The demons here have a dark aura. They draw their strength from it. Julia grabbed a branch. He turned it into a weapon, examining it. This invisible sword that he had created that day. Somehow, it absorbs that dark energy. He can turn it into his own power. MC thinks that the sword somehow interacts with the scar on his right hand, but he is not entirely sure about it. He puts away the weapon and stands up. He looks into the distance and frowns, realizing that in the world of darkness, there is only one rule: survival of the fittest. He knows that he is still alive only because he uses everything at his disposal. His cloak flutters in the wind. There is no one around. Julia makes a pained face. He wants to return as soon as possible. If not to his native third barrier city, then at least somewhere else. Any option is fine. During all his time wandering alone, he found nothing at all. Thoughts began to creep into his mind that perhaps he simply had topographical cretinism. But suddenly, MC came out onto what looked like a road and continued walking forward. He was still surrounded by piles of stones on both sides, with only a few trees here and there. Muddled silhouettes began to appear in the distance, and Julia quickened his pace. Soon he saw something that surprised him. In front of him stood a few wooden houses. He had stumbled upon a village. His eyes immediately lit up with hope. He had spent a whole year, on the verge of death, surviving in this gloomy world. All this time, he had thought only of how much he wanted to return home. And now he had found a settlement, and the MC hurried to explore this place. Until now, he had only encountered demons that looked more like goblins. But unlike their lair, this place was completely different. Julia approached one of the houses and was surprised by its size. Everything in this village was enormous. Suddenly, as if growing out of the ground itself, a man appeared behind him, so huge that he blocked out the sun. Clad in a wide cloak fastened on his powerful shoulders, he towered over the young man like an ancient oak tree over young saplings. His face, framed by a thick gray beard and mustache, looked down with fatherly curiosity. His voice, like thunder in the distant mountains, sounded like a greeting, causing Julia to freeze in amazement. He turned abruptly and panicked at the sight of the giant. Before him stood the cloud giants he had studied at the academy. They possess human intelligence, but their physical abilities surpass those of humans. They are a peaceful race, not particularly hostile to humans. The first giant to speak continued that there was a barrier here that detected enemies, but apparently it had not worked, so the resident asked the boy who he was. Julia scratched his cheek, hesitating, wondering what to do, whether it was better to answer honestly. The boy introduced himself by name and added that he belonged to the human race. The giants were surprised by this fact, and the magician's right hand, which was covered with a dark mark, made them doubt. They all unanimously called him a Twilight man, which made him think. MC had never heard of such a thing. He looked at the strangers' faces. They must surely know what was wrong with his hand. He heard heavy footsteps behind him, and the boy slowly turned around. He immediately recoiled in fear. This giant looked many times stronger than the others. He was most likely their leader. After a moment of silence, the giant spoke. He had heard the entire conversation and introduced himself as the head of the settlement. His name was Edgar. Then he turned and strode away, motioning for his guest to follow him. The guest, still confused, stared at his receding back. The cloud giants are called demons, and MC finds this a little strange because he does not feel any hostility. But it seems impossible for him to refuse. Now there was nothing left to do but obey. So MC followed the leader. They entered one of the houses and sat down opposite each other on the floor, crossing their legs in the Turkish style. The guest told his story, and now his interlocutor understood how things stood. After all, leaving the city and wandering for a whole year in foreign lands is not an easy thing for a person to do. MC asked Edgar if he knew about the barrier cities. The cloud giants maintain mutual neutrality with humans, so the leader has some information. Edgar immediately remembered that about 3 years ago, a guy with a red mark on his hand, like Julia's, came to their land. MC immediately perked up, very interested to know if the giant knew anything about this mark. The giant said that it was a symbol of Twilight people, proof that a person had adapted to Twilight. Julia asked again, and the chief explained that Twilight was destructive to humans, but those who had adapted to it were considered exceptions. Creatures that live in Twilight possess the power of Twilight mastery. Rumor has it that Twilight people are the only ones who can resist this power. Julia put his fist to his lips, processing the information he had heard. He remembers holding a homemade weapon in his hand, and now he understands the secret of his invisible sword. The MC then asks about the man who came 3 years ago, and Edgar says that he stayed with them for a while and then left. He left behind several books. The owner of the house adds that Julia should be familiar with this topic, but he just looked questioningly, after which it was explained to him that it was about the degree of adaptation, perhaps even higher than that of the man. The boy thought about it, remaining silent, as he still didn't understand something. He asked for an explanation of what Twilight was, which everyone kept talking about. He only knew the legend that it all began 150 years ago, in the war between humans and demons. Edgar assured him that he knew exactly the same amount. What Twilight is and why it happens is a mystery. He covered his eyes and, as if by the way, asked his guest if he wanted to return to the city. MC exclaimed his agreement, saying he really wanted to, but he didn't even know where it was. All this time, he had done nothing but wander. His face was contorted with surprise when he was told he could take a map. His eyebrows shot up, his eyes widened, expressing complete disbelief at what was happening. At the same time, the giant's face remained calm and slightly condescending. He stood up and, looking down at MC, suggested a duel. Clenching his hands into fists, the chief continued, saying that they were a tribe of warriors, that they had also fought that man, but he had lost. Therefore, he proposed a one-on-one duel, and he intended to fight with all his strength. The conditions were that if Julia won, she would receive a map and a book, as well as food and everything else she needed for her journey. Edgar looked the guy in the eyes, waiting for him to respond to his proposal. The MC thought about his answer. It was unexpected for him, but at least he didn't feel any hostility during the conversation and thinks that he can probably trust him. Besides, he himself was curious to see what he was capable of, so he gladly accepted the duel. Edgar and Julia stood facing each other on the street. It was clear, and the wind blew their cloaks playfully. The leader holds his sword in front of him, warning that this is not a fight to the death, so the blade is blunt. The MC agreed and said he would do the same. The illusion went into action, fulfilling its master's request. Edgar carefully examined the stranger's weapon, taking note. He immediately leaned forward, calling for the duel to begin, and went on the offensive. It was sharp and sudden, causing Julia's eyes to widen involuntarily. He quickly stepped aside, and his opponent's sword pierced the air where he had been standing. The guy knows that a direct sword strike has enormous power, but it is easy to dodge. The next moment, he saw movement on his right and reacted immediately, and the ringing clang of metal echoed through the air. MC managed to block the blow, but he also noticed that his opponent had changed the trajectory of his sword. He knew it was inertia control magic, but he didn't think cloud giants could use it. Edgar, in turn, noticed that Julia was using a sword he had created with an illusion. It was so perfect that it was terrifying, but that was to be expected from a Twilight person. After analyzing the situation, MC came to a conclusion that he would have to fight seriously. With a deafening roar, as if space itself were tearing apart, their figures merged in a whirlwind of rapid blows. Sparks of magic flashed around them and fragments of earth flew apart, while each blow echoed with a rumble that made their ears ring. Julia's gaze was intense. He understood perfectly well that this fight could not be prolonged. Everything had to be decided as quickly as possible. The giant's face was approaching. His nose with a thick mustache seemed to be sniffing the air, and his eyes narrowed cunningly. MC jerked. His wooden hilt flew out of his hand, and the sword and ghost sword disappeared. He exclaimed with obvious irritation and anxiety, realizing that his body was reacting unusually. With a cry filled with determination, the giant brought down his blow. His eyes burned with focused energy, and his long hair fluttered behind him, emphasizing the power of his movement. And when he finished his movement, he froze. Near his neck was the ghostly sword, which, according to the idea, had fallen from his opponent's hand. The leader looked at the blade, then at its owner, analyzing what had happened at that moment. Gritting his teeth, the MC continued to hold the illusory blade to the stranger's neck, using his fingers instead of the hilt of the sword, and managed to lull his opponent into a false sense of security. Edgar closed his eyes, accepting defeat. He was delighted with this move. Julia admitted that he had lost. After all, he had only fought with all his might from the middle of the battle, and he was sure that the chief wasn't serious either. The other man sheathed his sword and did not give a clear answer. Then he spread his arms and announced that the mage had won the duel, so he would give him what he had promised. He immediately added that it was time for the guest to leave if he wanted to get home. The young man looked down at the ground, lost in thought, and then closed his eyes as if he were making up his mind about something. Plucking up his courage, he asked the chief if he could stay a little longer. The giant looked at him, listening intently. MC thought that perhaps he should practice a little more. All this year spent in the wastelands, he had thought so many times that once he fell asleep, he would never wake up again. Julia brought her right hand to her face, examining it. This was important to him because he had learned the law of the strong eat the weak. Therefore, in order to return home safely, he decided that he must first become as strong as possible. Edgar looked at Julia, at first a little surprised, even a little inspired by such a speech. And then he suddenly burst out laughing. He liked MC's attitude. Therefore, on such an occasion, he suggested that he give it his all, for which he received sincere gratitude in return. They had taken care of MC for a long time, and now he was leaving the village with a smile on his face and a backpack on his back, while the cloud giant saw him off with the whole settlement. He had lived with them for 6 months, and today, a difficult day awaited him, but MC promised himself to be strong. He turned back one last time to the villagers, bidding them farewell with a calm smile, and set off on his journey. On the way, he took the very book he had received from Edgar out of his knapsack. Opening it to the right page, he continued reading, even though he understood that it was about the Twilight world and the Asmodeans. But the text was written in a rather convoluted way. MC was a little saddened. He had the feeling that he was missing something obvious. He frowned, sighing desperately, and decided that when he returned to the city, he would ask someone to take a look at it. Then he looked at the dark trees around him and caught himself thinking about returning to the city, remembering the incident that had caused him to travel in the first place. He continued on his way and decided that even if he returned now, he didn't need to think about it. After all, being here was the best thing that had ever happened to him. MC looked worn out. His gaunt face was covered in sweat. There were shadows of fatigue under his eyes, and his eyebrows twitched involuntarily. It had been 6 months since he left the village of the Cloud Giants, but he still hadn't reached the city. He continued to trudge along with his back hunched, knowing that this way he would eventually reach his destination. In addition to fatigue, he was very hungry, as he had not encountered a single monster to eat in the last few days. Julia was so desperate that he was ready to collapse, but he kept telling himself that he was almost there. He raised his exhausted gaze forward. He looked as if through a cloudy film, but saw the outlines of something familiar. It seemed to be a barrier city. The guy opened his eyes wide and could see clearly now. He shouted in amazement that there was indeed a real barrier city in front of him. MC looked at these walls, almost unable to believe it was true. His whole body trembled as if he were about to cry. And indeed, a couple of tears did fall. And then he jumped up briskly, stretching his arms upward in a victory cry, signaling that he had returned after all. But then his enthusiasm suddenly vanished, replaced by a sense of anticipation of imminent calm. Feeling safe, his body instantly relaxed, and the guy fell forward, face first on the ground. It was a familiar position, and he lay there, unresponsive. Someone's foot stopped next to his hand. It was a girl named Sherry passing by. Her thick bangs hit her forehead, and her long, straight hair swayed slightly in the wind. Dressed in her Magic Academy uniform, she was passing by and accidentally noticed the body lying on the ground. MC struggled to lift his heavy eyelids and try to focus his vision, feeling as if he had risen from the dead. Noticing the change in his surroundings, he opened his eyes wide and jumped up in bed, trying to sit up, but his body was still heavy. He found himself in a bright room with empty beds around the perimeter, similar to the one the guy was now lying in. Glancing around, he noticed two people standing next to his bed the whole time. The first to speak was a woman wearing glasses. She was dressed in a jacket and tie, her hair neatly gathered and tied in a cute bow. With a friendly smile, she introduced herself as Elsa and asked the young man his name. Julia responded by giving his full name and asked what kind of place this was. He was told that he was in the 7th barrier city. MC was a little taken aback, but he was glad to be back in a barrier city, even if it was the 7th. He had missed a lot, but he hoped everything would be all right. Elsa introduced the second girl, standing slightly behind her. Sherry was a student at the Demon Academy who had been training when she found him unconscious in the outside world. Elsa realized that he was wearing the uniform of the Demon Academy from the 3rd barrier city. It was dirty, so she washed it. She also received confirmation from the Academy of the 3rd barrier city via magical communication. While Elsa was speaking, Julia glanced at the student, who was studying him intently in return and seemed as if she could burn a hole in him with her gaze. Elsa found a photo of the guy on the missing persons list. She also knew that he had been missing for 2 whole years, so she asked what he had been doing all this time. MC lowered his gaze and thought for a moment. He had to be vigilant. He didn't know if he could trust them. Still, he felt he had to be honest. So he held out his right hand, which was marked and trembling heavily, and with a plaintive expression on his face, said that before telling his story, he would like to eat something, as he was very hungry. Elsa blew the air out of her puffed cheeks, as if trying to calm herself. Then she asked Sherry to bring something to eat. MC was in 7th heaven, holding a hot mug in his left hand and a large, appetizing sandwich in his right. His mouth was smeared with crumbs, but he didn't care much about that and continued to chew, feeling his stomach gradually fill with heaviness. Elsa spoke up, asking if it was true that the guy had spent 2 years in Twilight. Julia looked up from her food and glanced excitedly at her companion, confirming the information. He continued that it was hard to believe, but it wasn't that unbelievable, including the blessing on his right hand. He looked at the window, and Elsa said that, one way or another, the question of his future was now at stake. She asked if he was going to return to his city and what he thought about the academy. Julia lowered his dull gaze, clutching the blanket in his hands. He admitted that he dreamed of becoming a good exorcist, but there was no place for him in his hometown. Elsa hummed thoughtfully, then asked what the young man thought about becoming a master at the Demon Academy in their city. In fact, she was the president of the academy, so she could transfer him if she wanted to. Julia was pleasantly surprised and, stammering a little, agreed to the offer. But Sherry, who was standing behind them, decided to express her disagreement. She addressed the woman as Mom, but quickly corrected herself, referring to her position instead. She stood in a hostile pose, spreading her legs wide and putting her hands on her hips. With a dissatisfied expression, she declared that she couldn't believe that such a weak and helpless child could have spent 2 years in Twilight. She thinks it's a lie, and because of his disheveled hair, he looked like a complete weirdo, so she couldn't trust him. Elsa once again introduced Sherry not only as a student, but also as her daughter, who had also helped the boy. She still stood with a dissatisfied look on her face and looked at him with the same expression. Elsa agreed with her daughter that Julia was indeed in trouble, but he was already a graduate student, so he thought it wouldn't be a problem. Sherry, in a combative mood, decided to put forward her conditions. Julia would be able to transfer if she won the fight, but if she lost, she would have to return to her hometown. The MC's face was filled with suffering, as if he were being deliberately mocked. Sherry asked the director if such conditions were possible. She sighed, but decided that if it was safe, she would allow them to have the fight. But it was important to her to hear the other side's opinion, so she asked Julia what she thought about it. MC suddenly remembered that a similar situation had occurred a year ago, when Edgar had suddenly challenged him to a duel for some reason. The girl waited for an answer, and he hastened to choose one. In fact, he did not want to return to his hometown and to the people who had betrayed him. So he agreed. He was serious and confident in his decision. He had to try his best in the new place. They went out to a small wasteland. The opponents stood facing each other, each with their weapons at the ready, and Elsa stood aside as a judge to oversee the fight. She announced a one-on-one fencing match. Sherry pulled her wooden sword to her chest, her face serious. The judge explained a few important points. The opponents could use magic, but if they realized it was dangerous, they had to stop immediately. She then made sure that both sides had heard her correctly. Sherry swung her sword and called out to Julia. She had forgotten to tell him in advance that she was an A rank. The boy was clearly not ready for such news, and all he could do was express his admiration for her. Then she held her weapon out in front of her, blade up, and they exchanged information about their ages. They were both 15. She reminded him again that she had an A rank and asked if her opponent understood what that meant. Elsa waved her hand, signaling the start of the fight. Sherry shouted that he would never win and immediately moved forward, attacking while MC remained standing in place. It seemed like only a second had passed, but the opponents were already standing in a final battle pose. Sherry seemed not to notice anything while Julia stood behind her, holding her wooden sword to her opponent's neck. He was not very tense. It was clear that this victory came very easily and naturally to him. Now MC stood with his eyes downcast, as if he felt awkward or guilty about something. He understood everything immediately from the position of his feet before the attack. He didn't even need to use his invisible sword, as he was stronger. Sherry did not want to accept defeat. She felt awkward, so she fiercely demanded another battle, and the guy had to agree. But each battle ended the same way, which made both of them feel awkward. In the end, there were 10 defeats in a row. Julia continued to stand almost in the same place, while his opponent sat on the ground with her head down. They exchanged glances. Sherry's eyes were wet, and Julia was already beginning to worry. But she got to her feet and accepted her defeat. She looked at him again, expecting him to say something stupid, but then apologized and acknowledged his strength. Julia was a little embarrassed and hastened to explain that it wasn't like that it just happened that way. But Elsa interrupted him, reminding them that it was just a bet. She turned to the MC and appointed him a student of the Demon Academy of the 7th Barrier City and welcomed him as an A-rank mage. Elsa said she would provide information about the transfer later and asked if there was anything else they could do to help the young man. He looked puzzled and simply asked for his overgrown hair to be cut. MC stands at the academy in his new look with an inspired smile on his face. Now he has a new place, a new uniform, a new hairstyle. His new life has begun. Already in the classroom, he introduced himself to his new classmates and told them the reason why he had transferred from the academy in the 3rd Barrier City. He tried to express his friendliness sincerely and hoped that he would be able to get along with the guys. 3 people were looking at him. A large, stern-looking guy with a square face named Keith, Sherry, whom he already knew, and another dark-haired girl with a short haircut named Sophia. The latter was excited about the new acquaintance and even had a question, so she raised her hand to get the MC's attention. Sophia asked if the rumors were true that Julia had spent 2 whole years in Twilight. He laughed, hiding his slight nervousness, and assured her that this was not the case, that he had simply moved here due to certain circumstances. He also denied the rumors that he had defeated Sherry in a duel, explaining that he had simply met her by chance while filling out paperwork and that there had been no duel. Sophia was a little surprised that it was all just rumors, but her curiosity seemed to be satisfied. However, Keith had a question. He was curious about MC's exorcist rank. Julia hesitated slightly, not really wanting to share this information, but he answered honestly nonetheless. The guys were amazed, as if they couldn't believe it, because it turned out that he could defeat Sherry. MC immediately became flustered and armed himself with excuses that it was accidental and not that important. Sherry herself, watching the others' antics, just frowned and snorted. Julia was walking down the hallway with Elsa, who was amused that he had been bombarded with questions from day one. She explained that it was rare to find a transfer student and warned the boy to try to avoid rumors. He shrugged his shoulders slightly in embarrassment, but obeyed. Elsa specified that he should not mention his right hand for a while, as it would only cause unnecessary concern. Julia understood this perfectly well, so he agreed without asking any questions. Before enrollment, he had to undergo a health checkup. Elsa said that usually all students undergo a simple examination before enrollment. But in the case of his right hand, she asked him to undergo a medical examination. MC readily agreed because he also wanted to know what had happened to his body. Elsa announced the conclusion. The guy had been diagnosed with a new disease. It is called Twilight Syndrome. Julia froze with his eyes wide open, not knowing how to react. Elsa added that he was in the 5th stage and possibly even higher. Twilight Syndrome was discovered by scientists a year and a half ago. Twilight has a detrimental effect on the human body, as evidenced by the stage of the disease. Upon reaching stage 5, a normal person loses their mind and dies, but Julia had lived in this state for 2 years, and nothing had happened. MC tensed up, listening intently. Elsa continued speaking. He recently said that he had heard about the Twilight Lands from the Cloud Giants. The Academy team had also conducted research on this. Elsa was hearing about Twilight people for the first time, but another word could be substituted. MC's eyes widened, already understanding on his own that they were talking about S-rank exorcists. Elsa explained that exorcists of this rank were capable of resisting the Twilight Lands, although those of rank A could as well. She cannot know what the man who visited the village of Cloud Giants wanted to convey, but she could assume that Julia possessed the abilities of an S-rank exorcist, and that was worth its weight in gold. MC lowered his head. He had mixed feelings. Acquiring such abilities was good, but he still did not get a definite answer as to what he had turned into. But there was nothing he could do about it, especially since research was being conducted. So he decided it was better to relax than to try to unravel the mystery of his condition. Elsa caught his attention to tell him that he would have a room in the student dormitory. Only a small room used by the lecturer for night shifts was available, so he would have to live there for a while. Julia laughed. For him, compared to Twilight, it was simply paradise. Before leaving, Elsa asked him to get along with Sherry, and then they said goodbye. When Elsa disappeared around the corner, MC felt someone's gaze on the back of his neck. He began to turn around, and all this time Sherry was watching him from behind the corner. Their eyes met. She frowned, and her cheeks flushed. Sherry quickly came out of her hiding place and strode toward her target. Stopping in front of him, she looked at him as if she were about to challenge him to a duel, but Sherry just called him outside. There were 2 appetizing sandwiches on the napkin. Julia stared at her classmate as if spellbound. Her cheeks flushed with the thoughts that came to mind, but her eyes asked a question. They sat together on a bench. Sherry, her face pink, folded her hands on her knees in front of her and explained that this was for him, because he probably hadn't brought lunch, and he probably had no one to eat with either. MC, with puppy dog eyes filled with tears, thanked Sherry. She quietly watched as he closed his eyes and ate the lunch she had brought him. Without thinking twice, she decided to ask him a question about Twilight. Julia looked at her and nodded, giving her permission. She was interested in how he managed to survive what he ate. Julia said that he ate monsters because there was nothing else. He also ate all kinds of frogs, snakes, and spiders, which turned out to be surprisingly tasty. Sherry, hearing the list of these creatures, grimaced in disgust, but continued to listen. Before he got used to it, it was very difficult for him. MC smiled calmly and good-naturedly and added that he still considered ordinary food, such as what he was holding in his hands now, to be the most delicious. Sherry regained her calm expression and exhaled. She concluded that for someone so strong, food was the only reason for excitement. But the guy hastened to refute this idea because he only became strong because he found himself in Twilight. And his interlocutor did not argue. He closed his eyes and, smiling sweetly, admitted that before that he had been ranked E, and among his peers he had been at the very bottom of the rating. Then Sherry wondered what someone like him was doing in the Twilight. Julia did not answer this question right away. He looked silently ahead. It was unpleasant for him to remember those who had put him in such a situation. But he began his story by saying that at the academy, they form groups when they learn to hunt. Sherry sensed his change of mood and looked at him sympathetically, letting him know that she understood what he was talking about. He continued that it was during such training that the leader led them into a dangerous area. Julia lowered his head. There were more enemies than expected, and at this point, MC paused dramatically, revealing that it was difficult for him to talk about it. Sherry furrowed her brow, already guessing what happened next in the story. Julia confirmed her guesses that he had been used as bait. After luring all the enemies to him alone, they closed themselves off with a magical barrier. Now Julia thinks that the barrier would have disappeared after a while, but at that moment, he couldn't even think about staying there for a single night. So he had no choice but to move on. He smiled awkwardly and ended the story by saying that he ended up getting lost and couldn't find his way back. That's all. Sherry frowned. She thinks they were too cruel to the guy. He concluded that in that situation, instead of building a barrier when the whole team returned, they decided that it would be easier and more correct to escape using him as bait, and he couldn't think otherwise. Sherry turned her head toward him and, raising her eyebrows, asked if he was offended by this. He raised his head and smiled good-naturedly. He wasn't entirely sure if he was offended, but for him, walking through that vast, terrifying twilight, it probably didn't matter anymore. He was completely desperate at that point. After these words, Sherry lowered her head, hiding her eyes under her bangs. She suddenly understood what his strength was. In fact, he was distinguished by his courage. MC seemed to be embarrassed by this, so he didn't fully agree with it. After a brief silence, Sherry spoke again uncertainly. She was not used to asking people for such things. Her cheeks flushed, but her eyes were still hidden behind her bangs. She asked him if he would agree to train her, because she also wanted to become stronger. Julia turned sharply toward her, froze in surprise, and asked again, as if what he had heard had not yet reached his brain. But she remained silent and did not raise her head. Only her lips were slightly pursed with excitement. He turned back, looking into the distance, and agreed to her request, if he was up to it. Sherry immediately turned to him, her face beaming with joy and excitement, and admitted that she had actually been thinking about it all day. Julia, glancing at her reaction, lost his former confidence and blushed. He managed to say that she could turn to him at any time, for which he received a dazzling smile and sincere gratitude in return. Not long ago, MC could not have imagined that the time would come when he would be able to rejoice like this, when her smile would be so dazzling. He is happy and wants to cherish this new life. Several days have passed since then. Julia was walking alone down a dark street, having stayed late due to training with Sherry and academic preparation. Thinking about the dinner he had missed today, he walked calmly toward the dormitory. Suddenly, he sensed a stranger's presence behind him and stopped. He sensed someone's hostility. Assuming that it might be monsters in the city, he began to look around to figure it out. His eyebrows furrowed and his eyes widened as he suddenly realized that it was human hatred, but not just any human. It was as if it were something Twilight. Julia froze when he heard a strange voice behind him. The voice said that it had initially wanted to test him secretly, but decided that it wasn't in its nature. Julia turned around and saw a man in uniform with a short haircut and an equally short beard standing there. He had a cheeky expression on his face, and his overall appearance resembled that of a bandit. He slung his long sword over his shoulder and called the guy by name, and challenged him to a face-to-face fight. MC became alert and, frowning, asked who he was. The man smiled slyly and promised that if Julia survived, he would definitely tell him. Without even letting him finish, he suddenly lunged at the MC like a released arrow. His face, contorted with rage, expressed only one desire: to crush. Each attack was aimed at breaking the guy's defense, knocking him off his feet, forcing him to retreat. The furious onslaught left no time for thought, forcing Julia to dodge and block the blows, trying not to get caught in the deadly hail. The enemy's sword struck Julia's ghostly blade with force, sending a shiver through his hands. A crazy, smug smile played on the attacker's face. He was impressed that the guy was capable of something, and he wanted to continue his entertainment. He delivered another powerful blow, which MC was able to parry. He dug his feet into the ground, trying in vain to stop the onslaught, his mind simply acknowledging that the man in front of him was too strong. Someone whispered nearby, and when that indistinct whisper reached them, the man froze with his sword raised in his hand and looked puzzled at the stones that were also suspended in the air around his limb. Julia felt that she too could not move, which made her eyes widen in surprise. A completely unarmed girl in the same Magic Academy uniform emerged from the thicket. She calmly called on the fighters to stop, and it became clear to them that her magic was responsible for their immobilization. Approaching them, she addressed a man named Gil and reproached him for promising not to attack her like that. Without hiding his mischief, he admitted that he was guilty, saying that he just wanted to test MC in person. Julia herself decided to speak up to ask who was in front of her. Gil turned to him and, flashing his broad, crooked smile, apologized for the suddenness of it all, then introduced himself. The girl standing next to him, with a calm gaze and a sweet smile, introduced herself as Claudia. Seeing Julia's puzzled face, she noted that, even after learning their names, he was still confused because they were not as well known as he was. Gil explained that they were both S-rank exorcists. MC's face contorted in shock, but he continued with a kind expression, saying that he was about to meet the number 1 S-rank exorcist, Cyrus. Julia was surprised by every word, but then he managed to control himself and asked them to stop talking, as it was all too sudden for him. Claudia decided to take control of the conversation. She apologized to MC and explained that Gil was a little out of sorts and that he shouldn't be paid any attention. Ignoring Gil's indignation, She said that she would explain everything in detail now. Julia frowned slightly, preparing to listen carefully. She decided to start by saying that he had mastered the fighting technique perfectly. Apologizing, she admitted that as soon as the guy arrived, they had been watching him constantly. They even caught a glimpse of his victory in the fight with Sherry. Moreover, they, the S-rank exorcists, had come to a certain conclusion. To discuss this, someone wanted to meet with him. Cyrus. MC stared intently at Claudia, his eyebrows furrowed with nerves, his eyes still wide open, and his lips tightly pursed. Every time, too many sudden events fall on him. Exhaling, he closed his eyes, thinking. At least he understood the situation, and when he thought about it, he understood why they had decided to watch him. Cyrus ranks first among the 12 S-rank exorcists. Although he is insanely famous, practically no one knows his face. A Twilight hero, the strongest of all living people. MC wonders what such a person could possibly want with him. The trio stands in front of a stone house with a wooden roof. Claudia said that Cyrus is here. Julia looked at the house. He was so engrossed in conversation that he didn't even notice how they got there. Suddenly, his two companions began to say goodbye to him, wishing him well, which upset the guy. He didn't want to go alone. Julia looked like a lost kitten as he watched their receding backs, and behind him, he heard the sound of a door opening. A thin guy with glasses looked out and called the guy by name. After making sure that this was the guest they were expecting, he asked him to come into the house. They stood on opposite sides of the dining table, and the host apologized and asked the guest to wait a moment while he made tea, inviting him to sit down at the table for the time being. Julia remained standing and asked the guy with the long braid where Mr. Cyrus was. The man replied with a friendly smile that he was Cyrus and that he was pleased to meet them. MC was very surprised. He had expected to see someone who looked stronger. Cyrus just laughed at this. He often heard such comments from his comrades. Holding a mug in his hand and stirring it, he announced that the tea was almost ready. Julia watched as he looked puzzled at the mug, muttering that he had added too much sugar, while thinking to herself that she didn't really believe that this man was Cyrus. He seemed too ordinary. Cyrus approached him, extended his hand, introduced himself properly, and shared that he was pleased to meet him. Julia extends his hand in response for a handshake, expressing that he is also pleased to meet him. Suddenly, a surge of dark energy filled the room around them. MC was horrified and frowned, feeling as if something had cracked inside him. He was unfamiliar with this magic, but he felt an oppressive, enormous power being transmitted through the other person's hand. Looking at the friendly face in front of him, he realized that there was absolutely no hostility, which is why he could say with certainty that there could be no mistake and that this was indeed the person he was looking for. Cyrus suddenly withdrew his hand and apologized for scaring her, but now he thinks that Julia will not have to doubt his words. Cyrus decided to get straight to the point and tell his guest directly. He wants MC to become an S-rank exorcist. Julia was surprised by this statement and didn't know how to respond. Cyrus continued, saying that he had come to the conclusion that Julia was quite capable of doing so. But seeing the confusion and apologetic smile on the other person's face, he assumed that he didn't want to. Julia hastened to refute this and explained that so many sudden developments had fallen upon him that his head was spinning. Cyrus just laughed and admitted that he was just as confused. He sat down at the table and continued talking. He hoped that Julia understood how unusual he was, and that was why Cyrus couldn't just leave it at that, so he hoped they would get along. MC didn't answer, but began to think that there was a 1 in a million chance that he could become an enemy of humanity. Apparently, Cyrus thinks he should befriend him before that happens, and he doesn't see anything surprising in that. After all, when someone exceptional appears, it's natural to want to control them. Julia lowered his head. Becoming an excellent exorcist was his dream. But when it came down to it, dreaming about it felt like running away from reality. Julia decided to tell Cyrus that he wasn't confident in his abilities right now. Cyrus asked if that was the only reason. But Julia didn't answer, only looked up at his interlocutor. Cyrus closed his eyes, took a sip of tea from his mug, and continued. Regardless of his thoughts, he believed that it was best for him to be with them, in the S-rank exorcist squad. He explained that they were just like him. Cyrus rolled up the sleeve of his right arm to show his guest. MC raised his eyebrows in surprise when he saw the exact same Twilight syndrome on the stranger's arm. Cyrus said that almost all S-rank exorcists had this disease. They were studying methods to combat it, and they had more information. Cyrus smiled faintly. Looking at his cup, he said there was something else. The royal family is currently conducting inspections in every city. They are the last of the 7 barrier cities, so they want to strengthen security a little more before returning to the first city. This time, it was decided to take several local students. Cyrus and the others want to recommend Julia, so he asked what he thinks about it. but he just stared silently and seriously at one point. Realizing that there would be no answer for the time being, Cyrus continued his speech. Since its defeat in the Great War, humanity has not changed, maintaining its status for the sake of peace and losing its position. They must soon begin to move forward. Cyrus looked at Julia very seriously and expressed the main idea that now was the time to bring light back into this world. MC suddenly realized that this was indeed what his father had been pursuing, and now it was his turn. He lowered his head and said that he understood everything, but for now, he had no faith in his own abilities. Then he raised his head, clenched his fists, and declared resolutely that despite this, he would take on the duties of an S-rank exorcist. Cyrus smiled kindly at him, letting him know that he had made the right choice. Hiding his awkwardness, Julia decided to share his personal opinion. He dreams of having at least one strong comrade, which is why he wants to believe Cyrus. After that, he thanked the host for the warm welcome. The next day at the academy, Julia sat at his desk and thought about yesterday's meeting with Cyrus and his proposal. Julia wasn't sure if he could handle it, but decided it would be better to go back to his room, calm down, and think it over again. He lay his face on the table in despair. He had a very important decision to make. Suddenly, someone called out to him, and he looked up. Sherry was standing in front of him, holding a bag of books. She had been asked to give him some of them. She placed the book he needed on the table, and MC thanked her. For now, he could think about something else. Sherry watched him as he leafed through the pages. According to her, everything they read was recorded in this book, and they didn't need to show their notes. Julia was 2 years behind, but wanted to continue her studies. He kept his eyes on the pages, but continued to say aloud that he wanted to contribute his knowledge of Twilight, because that would increase the chances of survival. Sherry looked at his calm, even slightly smiling face for a few more moments. Then she turned away, a little embarrassed, and asked if he had time and what he thought about special training. Julia glanced at her, raising his eyebrows slightly, a pale pink pigment appearing on his cheeks. At first, he made an incomprehensible sound, as if he had exhaled softly, and then he replied normally, agreeing. Sherry's classmates stood behind her. Sophia sighed, assuming they would have a date after class. But Sherry vehemently denied everything and repeated that it was just combat training. Without hiding her enthusiasm, Sophia shared that she was also not opposed to combining business with pleasure and turned to her friend standing nearby with a question about what he thought. Keith just sighed and replied that she was already strong enough. Sherry suddenly asked them if it was true that they would soon receive an A rank. Sophia happily replied that she had already been appointed and Keith's certificate should arrive soon. Sherry also shared rumors that the school had selected several people to provide royal security. Sophia and Keith confirmed that this was true, and they were both confident that they would be chosen. Sophia believed that it was very fortunate to be able to enter another barrier. Keith objected, saying that this was not some kind of excursion, but Sophia believed that one should enjoy it nonetheless. MC watched the amusing exchange between his classmates with a calm smile and breathed a sigh of relief when he realized that he would not be involved in this topic. Sherry's blade cut through the air with incredible speed, like lightning. Her face, focused and serious, showed her complete dedication to the training. Each swing was executed with precision and grace, reflecting years of hard work. Julia, watching her, frowned, carefully tracking her every move. He followed her every lunge, dodging and blocking her blows. During a break between attacks, he reminded her to watch her breathing and to put her strength only into the strike with which attacks. Her face, red and wet with sweat, expressed her determination not to give in on anything. She pushed off the ground and attacked. But the stranger's sword was at her neck again. She exhaled, accepting her defeat. Julia smiled calmly at her. She explained that her attacks were not yet good enough, but she had already strengthened her body and learned to control her momentum, which he considered impressive. Sherry smiled awkwardly, pleased by the praise. She turned away and, scratching the back of her head, said that of the two of them, he was the cool one, with amazing abilities. The more she trained with him, the more she understood this. He thought in a completely different way. Julia couldn't disagree, but added that she was also learning about this power. And she was definitely getting stronger, because understanding your opponent's power is part of your own. Sherry smiled sweetly and thanked him for his words. Rain was gathering in the sky, so they decided it was time to go back. On the way, Sherry asked if she could use his bathroom today, which made him freeze in shock. Sherry explained that the bathroom in the women's dormitory was currently under renovation. They promised to fix it by tomorrow, so everyone would get through today. She blushed slightly, admitting that she was so sweaty right now that it was disgusting. Julia replied uncertainly that it was no big deal, thereby giving his consent. Sherry, her face even redder, began to scold him, saying that she was just going to take a bath and that he shouldn't get any ideas. But he said he wasn't going to. Something dripped onto her cheek. It had started to rain. She urged MC to hurry back before it got any heavier. Upon arrival, Julia warned Sherry that she could use the bathroom, but there was one caveat. Originally, there was no bathtub in his room. Apparently, it was added later, and there are no walls, but there's a curtain. They looked at the transparent curtain, and both blushed from the embarrassing situation. Julia decided to wait outside, but Sherry pulled him back because it was already raining heavily outside. He looked out the window and sighed in confusion. It was indeed raining heavily. Sherry urged him to calm down and said that he could just stare at the wall for a while. It wasn't difficult. MC's face was already crimson and tense. He wanted to scream because he found himself in such an absurd situation. Sitting on a chair with his back to the bathtub, he couldn't stop thinking that right now, behind him, his classmate was taking a bath completely naked. He tried to stop his train of thought. He shouldn't be thinking about this, so he urgently needed to distract himself. But then he heard a noise coming from the bathtub, which distracted him. He became curious about what it was, what kind of noise it was, but he couldn't think about it, so he shook his head furiously. MC raised his exhausted gaze to the ceiling, sighing heavily. He ordered his mind to think about something else, such as S-rank exorcists, Saris, Gil, and Claudia, the royal guard. Suddenly, Sherry called out to him, and he flinched in surprise, blushing rapidly, as if she could read his thoughts. Sherry sat in a full bathtub with her hair tied up in a high bun, wondering what Julia thought about the rumors about the royal guard. MC hesitated, but she interrupted him, thinking that they might choose him too. But she wanted to get in too. MC pricked up his ears, listening intently. Her mother was the director of the academy, so everyone had been watching her since she enrolled. Sherry was lost in her memories, some watching her in anticipation, some out of jealousy, but she herself was just a talentless child. She thinks it's more like persecution. Sherry raised her head higher, so she could be heard better. She declared that she was not going to lose. She would try to get an A rank first among all her classmates. She wants to become stronger and is not going to lose to herself or anyone else. Julia smiled to himself, finding the stranger's confession endearing. He called out to Sherry. She turned toward him. Julia thought she would like to hear this, so he decided to tell her that he had been promoted to rank S. Sherry was so delighted that she couldn't find the words, but she congratulated him anyway. Julia thanked her and admitted that he was still confused. He couldn't believe it was real. 2 years ago, he was just a kid who dreamed of becoming an exorcist. But after surviving the Twilight and returning, he immediately received an A rank. It was too much change for him, and he really didn't want to stand out. Sherry looked at his back sympathetically. Suddenly, the MC raised his right arm with its rolled-up sleeve. He wanted her to look at it. Sherry looked in surprise at the intricate patterns tattooed on his arm. Julia explained that it was stage 5 Twilight syndrome. He had been in this state for 2 years. Twilight poisons ordinary people, but most S-rank exorcists are immune to it. MC gained his power while in Twilight, so he believes that he may no longer be entirely human. Sherry pursed her lips. It was hard for her to hear this. He continued that with this power, becoming an S-rank exorcist, he could be betrayed or abandoned again. Suddenly, MC flinched when he heard the rustle of a curtain being drawn. Then she heard the sound of bare feet running, and Julia turned her head back. Sherry stood completely naked, not even covered by anything, and she snapped at him not to talk such nonsense. Julia fell off his chair in shock, his face contorted. Sherry pointed at him just as fiercely, telling him not to be afraid of his strength. And he, nervous, as if cornered, exclaimed his agreement. Sherry continued to walk toward him, lamenting that she had told him more than once how strong he was. And it was not only about his abilities, but also about his desire to survive. She came so close to him that there was only a step between them, but she paid no attention to his nervous face and said that his strength was worthy of respect. She reached for his hand and continued, saying that she thought humans were intelligent beings after all, and perhaps he lacked the courage to face pain. But he was very kind to people, and at these words, Julia finally looked at his face, but then lowered her eyes, feeling embarrassed by their situation. She pulled his hand toward her, looked him straight in the eyes, her eyebrows slightly arched, expressing the sincerity of her words. She had no doubt that he was a good person. That's why she told him he shouldn't be afraid of people. Receiving his gratitude in return, her eyes glistened with tears, and she sincerely believed that she had really helped her classmate. A single tear rolled down the boy's cheek. He was very happy because he had wanted someone to say those words to him so badly. Sherry continued to hold his hand, closed her eyes, and with a calm smile advised him that he should not say such strange things anymore. He would become the light that could cut through this darkness. She could feel it. Julia smiled at her. and she laughed awkwardly. She finally realized that she had been standing in front of him without clothes on all this time. Blushing, she modestly covered her shoulder, looking away. Then she pointed her finger at him sharply and began to accuse him of preventing her from taking a bath. So she ordered him to turn away quickly. MC accepted the accusations and turned away. He smiled to himself because he had finally gained confidence. Now he was ready to become the light that cuts through the twilight. The next day, MC stood on the street near the academy and watched the students passing by. He repeated yesterday's promise in his head and mentally appealed to people not to doubt him. A strange female voice behind him made him flinch. It was Sherry, who wished him good morning. Julia was nervous, but greeted her back without looking her in the eye. Sherry looked at him puzzled, as if that would explain his strange behavior. But he wouldn't tell her that he now found it difficult to separate her naked image from her current one. When he looks at her, he unconsciously imagines her in various cute poses, which prevents him from pretending that nothing strange happened yesterday. Sophia, standing nearby, casually mentioned that they were together all the time, but she was interrupted by a sound that grew louder and louder. A foreign object whistled as it flew toward their feet, nearly killing them, and all three of them huddled together in surprise. When she came to her senses, Sophia exclaimed, trying to understand what had just happened. Keith approached them and apologized for the object that had flown far away, his sword slung over his neck. He explained that he had morning training for selection into the royal escort. Sweat was pouring from his face. To reach rank A, he wanted to train even harder. MC looked at him with a silent smile, pleased to see someone else's determination. The girls also looked at him with smiles and agreed with him on everything. Keith decided to start his training now, for his own reasons, so as not to be late for class. The guys sincerely supported him and wished him luck. Julia suddenly remembered Cyrus' word about his help and wondered what he meant. In the academy building, the three of them were already standing among other students like them at the bulletin board and news board. On the central banner, Julia read aloud that Sherry was joining the ranks of the royal escort. Her partner would be determined by a duel between him and Keith. Elsa approached them from behind, noting that the guys already knew the news. Julia, seeing her, immediately asked what it meant. Elsa did not answer the question right away, but invited them to take a walk, promising to explain everything on the way. Sherry went out into the corridor with them, as the conversation concerned her directly. Elsa explained that the current requirements for the escort were one boy and one girl. Everything was simple with the girl, as Sherry was now at the top of the list. However, opinions were divided at the meeting between the faction and the royal representative regarding the boy. One side was in favor of Julia, while the other was in favor of Keith. In the end, it was decided to rely on the outcome of a duel to select the most suitable candidate. Elsa added that there were no conditions regarding the style of combat, but they should not forget that the battle was not real. The MC listened to her carefully and processed the information. Suddenly, Cyrus appeared before them, as if he had been waiting for the moment when he could speak, and apologized to the young man. Realizing that it was Cyrus, the young man exclaimed his name in surprise, and Cyrus greeted him with a friendly smile. Julia, realizing who he was, also greeted him, but Sherry, hearing his famous name, fell into a state of shock. Adding to Elsa's words, Cyrus said that opinions were divided because two polar opposite views had collided. He also said that he needed to talk to the second participant, and Julia immediately remembered the image of Keith, whom she had met that morning. It was immediately apparent that he took his training seriously. Cyrus announced that representatives of the monarchy would be leaving earlier than planned, so the duel would have to take place today. But if Julia wasn't ready, he could try to postpone it. However, the MC objected, looked at him firmly, clenched his fists, and insisted on today. Cyrus smiled back at him and told him to come to the training field after class. After that, he announced to everyone that the conversation was over. Sherry looked at Julia intently. She said that he would have to put in a lot of effort. Julia just lifted the corners of his lips in a hint of a smile. He understood perfectly well. He thinks that if he hadn't shown up so unexpectedly today, they would have chosen Keith. And most likely, he understands that too. The girl quietly called his name. Not knowing what to say, she could see that he was just hiding behind that smile. MC put his hand on his chest and seriously declared that he wanted to show Keith what he was worth. He still feels guilty towards him, and he wants to get an S rank, so he has no doubts about what to do. Sherry's eyes lit up when she saw his confidence and determination. She has no doubts about him either. Soon, the two duelists stood on the training field with weapons in their hands. Cyrus, acting as the judge, warned before the start that the condition of the duel was the victory of one of them. The main weapon was a wooden sword, but magic was allowed. Keith closed his eyes and turned to his opponent. This was unexpected for him, but he promised to do everything in his power. Julia, who had been standing with his head down, suddenly looked up at him with interest and a desire to win in his eyes, promising him that he would do the same. The judge announced the start, and Keith, standing in a fighting stance, called on his opponent to attack first with a battle cry. He swung widely and cut through the space in front of him with his sword, and an explosive wave of earth rose from it, freezing in the air as if it were a normal sea wave rising during a storm. MC watched this manipulation with interest, realizing that Keith was creating a barrier out of the ground, and today he was lucky enough to see how earth magic worked. In an instant, his opponent, hiding behind the barrier, was behind him and prepared to attack. At that moment, there was a collision and a loud clang rang out in the air, but the attack failed. Keith was behind the barrier again, and the guys exchanged glances. Julia realized that he was attacking while hiding behind this wall, and the petrification made his blows stronger. But he could see him even if he was hiding, so MC swung his arm, preparing to attack. Suddenly, the earth flew toward him like a snake. MC instantly pushed off the ground, and the loose soil collapsed right where he had been standing. Julia flew back a little, but managed to land on his feet. Keith decided to explain his ability in more detail. That the Earth Fortress was not just a shield, but also a weapon. Behind him, the ground took on indefinite shapes, resembling moving limbs. Keith told Julia that he would not let him win. Clenching his fists, he directed the earthen fortress at his opponent like a cannon shot and shouted that it would crush him. MC stood ready, his wooden weapon already transformed into a ghostly sword. He noticed that Keith was striking accurately and even acknowledged that it was impressive, but he knew for sure that he would not lose. As proof of his words, he easily cut through the first piles of stones flying towards him, striking his opponent. With each passing moment, the clumps of earth grew more numerous, turning into a deadly flurry. The ghostly blades seemed to meet no resistance, passing through the stones as if through air. Each movement was honed to perfection, allowing him to split the flying debris into small pieces before they could touch him. MC's face, focused and unwavering, expressed absolute confidence in his abilities. A cold fire of determination burned in his eyes, and his firm chin betrayed the inner strength necessary to overcome this seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Keith, his eyes wide with amazement, suddenly realized that Julia had disappeared from view. Then, as if out of nowhere, Julia appeared behind him. His face was calm and focused, contrasting with the shock on his opponent's face. Julia voiced his thoughts aloud, saying that Keith controlled so much energy, turning it into a weapon, but even he must have a limit. That meant he just had to wait for the right moment and strike at his weak spot. And counterattack, Keith swallowed thick saliva, a drop of sweat rolling down his cheek. He closed his eyes and cursed. Then he calmly admitted defeat, while Julia, behind him, looked at the judge. Cyrus stood with his arms crossed over his chest, smiling silently, as if he had never doubted the outcome of the duel. After the fight, Keith approached with a question and his guess that this sword was Julia's ability. He confirmed it and explained that it was with its help that he coped with Twilight. MC demonstrated his weapon and added that it was effective against Twilight, but if a demon suddenly appeared, it would also be useful for ordinary magic. Keith just grumbled that it was somehow pretentious now. But then he closed his eyes, resigned himself, and wished him luck in demonstrating his powers outside the city barriers. MC smiled happily and thanked him. Before leaving, Keith warned that next time, victory would be his. Soon Cyrus approached MC, noticed that the guys were getting along well, and praised them. He said he was counting on him, while he would be in other barrier cities. And then he asked if he was from the third barrier city. The guy's pupils dilated at the mention of this place. Before leaving, Cyrus said that Julia would give him a detailed schedule later and said goodbye. Julia froze in place, remembering his hometown, but he immediately stopped himself. Thoughts of home were nice, of course, but he had changed since then, and that was what mattered now. He had started new life in a new place and made friends, so now he had to cherish the present. MC nodded to himself, coming to this conclusion. In the meantime, he needs to prove himself in escort work. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.